Well, good evening. My name is Herb. I'm an alcoholic. Welcome. So glad that I'm seeing all of you return. Please join me in prayer for an open mind and an open heart. I'm going to put that up on the screen in case you don't have it. I'll use my PowerPoints tonight. God, please set aside everything that I think I know about myself, my brokenness, my spiritual path, and you, for an open mind and a new experience with myself, my brokenness, my spiritual path, and especially you. Please join me in the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. I mentioned in my orientation that there are several areas in the big book that suggest setting aside, having an open mind, letting go of our prejudice. Two of them that I've already made mention of are on page 58 and 27. You may have made a note of that. It's worthy to go and find it and make sure that you see it and understand it. I read them out then. I'm not going to read them out again. This one happens to be on page 42. It meant I would have to throw several lifelong conceptions out the window. That was not easy. We looked at a deep look at spiritual awakening last week, the very beginning of step 12, having had a spiritual awakening. That's the promise of the 12-step process. That's the purpose of the 12-step process. That's the mission statement. That's the value proposition, all of those things. And I wanted everybody to be really clear why we're doing this. Oh, sure, we come to it from suffering of some kind, usually some form of addiction. And the promise is that you will be freed from that. Not until you finish the 9th step. If you want confirmation of that, take a look at pages 84 and 85. We'll take a deep dive into it next week when we do step 10. It says we're placed in a position of neutrality. Hear the grace of that, but hear the promise of that. We're placed in a position of neutrality with regard to our addiction. But then he says we're not cured. We have a daily reprieve. That's a promise. We have a daily reprieve, but it means that we have to do the work on a daily basis. Steps 10, 11, and 12, Bill calls our way of living, our way of living. That's the program of living. Steps 1 through 9, the program of recovery. Steps 10, 11, and 12, the program of living, the program of managing our life, the program of taking personal responsibility for our life. We looked at step 12, spiritual awakening. But there's a couple other parts there. I'm not going to look at those. I changed my mind actually today on those. I changed the schedule. If you have the schedule and you're looking at it, we were going to look at principles and sponsorship. But that's not the way I proceeded last week. I gave you the assignment on step 11, prayer and meditation. I wanted to take a look at principles and sponsorship at the end of looking at steps 12, 11, and 10. And then we'll take a look at sponsorship and principles. Just to be clear with people who might be following the schedule and wondering what happened to those topics. I'm not overlooking them. They're too important. That freedom assumes that we have a relationship with power because that's what this is all about. spiritual awakening. Spiritual doesn't mean anything in the sense of a religious experience or a religious tradition or a religious practice at all. Nothing. Spiritual means quite the opposite, actually. It means relationship. From my standpoint, a relationship with reality with a capital R, whatever that means to you, and we'll be looking at that later on. We'll talk a little bit about it tonight because it's the underbelly, the assumption of the foundation of steps 11, prayer meditation, step 11. The purpose of the steps is to find power. The purpose of the steps are not about addiction. The purpose of the steps is not about our life. Those are byproducts of finding power. When you find power, you get free of addiction. When you find power, you're able to navigate life smoothly, actually, in the flow. To become conscious. The thing that makes us specifically human is that we are conscious. And what I mean by that is a gorilla is conscious, but they're not conscious that they're conscious. We have a mind that can self-reflect. We can stand outside ourselves. We can transcend ourselves. We can look at ourselves and evaluate ourselves. And we can learn from our mistakes in a very conscious way and make free decisions. That's the other component that makes us specifically human, uniquely. When I get to step 1, I'll elaborate more on that, the model of what a human being is, because it's so critical, because that's the way step 1 is built. It's built especially for dealing with the addiction of the body and the addiction of the mind and the spiritual malady of the will. But those are also really important concepts here in step 11. I'm going to do, by my standards, a fairly superficial review of step 11 tonight. It will be sufficient to give you an idea as to what it is in the big book and what the practice means and what my experience is with it. I did a 3-hour workshop. I think it was 3, it could have been 4-hour workshop on October 24th that would be on YouTube. Similar to this, a Zoom workshop with PowerPoints. And if you have an interest in a deeper dive into the entire genre of intentional consciousness, that's my term for it, prayer, meditation, contemplation, centering prayer, transcendental meditation, mindfulness. You might want to look that up. But this will be sufficient for step 11. Because it was the exposure and the experience that I had in 1988. I was 4 years sober, and the man I engaged to be a step guide took me through the steps. And when we got to step 10, the big book says we enter the world of the spirit and we're not cured and we have a daily reprieve. And he unpacked for me step 10. I'll do that next week. That's the assignment, but I'll talk about that toward the end of my talk today. And then he unpacked for me step 11. It was pretty amazing. I think I mentioned, I'm not sure I mentioned, because I mentioned it often in many different settings, that I studied to be a Catholic priest at one time. For 7 years, I was in a seminary being trained to be a monk and a priest. I was a religious. I had the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And what I didn't know at the time that I signed up when I went in, it was silent. 7 years of silence. Well, you do a lot of meditation in that, and you get a lot of training in that, and you get a lot of time to do it, and a lot of books to read, and a lot of assignments, and a lot of classes. It still boggles my mind that when I left, after 7 years of training and 7 years of silence and 7 years of practice, I hung up my black robe and I didn't meditate again for another 25 years. because I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know the value of it. I put on meditation like I put on the black robe. It came from the outside, not from the inside. And when I took off the black robe, I gave up the meditation because they went together as far as I was concerned. That's what monks do. I left because I was doing things that monks don't do. That's a story for another day. But be that as it may, this man said to me, take a look at pages 85 to 88 in the big book. If you have your big book, it might help you. If you don't, it won't be a major interference as long as you're listening and maybe making some notes. So step 11 says, sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood God, praying only for knowledge of God's will for us and the power to carry that out. That's a mouthful, and I'm going to unpack it phrase by phrase. Sought. It's a very active invitation, step 11. Sure, it's about prayer and meditation, but very active. Look at the word sought. And I knew I was a seeker. I just didn't realize I wasn't a finder until I finished these steps through step 12. And then I realized I was a finder. I had a spiritual awakening. Not a white light experience, not a feeling of any type of elation or ecstasy. No. But I realized I had been changed. Sought through prayer and meditation. We're going to take a look at what does that mean. But then the step 11 tells us what the purpose is of step 11. It's not to feel good. It's not to feel serene. It's not to have a better life. It's not to have better relationships. It's to improve my conscious contact with God. There it is. I say it every morning. I have a meditation practice in the morning, every morning. I say the set-aside prayer. I say the third step prayer. Not to take the third step, but to renew my commitment to alignment, my word for the third step. Turning to be in alignment with the flow of the power. And then I repeat out to myself the exact step 11, because I want to remind myself why I'm here. I want to be very intentional. I want to be very conscious. This is not just a robot routine action like it was in the monastery. This is an active act of bringing my awareness to the presence of God for lots of purposes, and I'll talk about that in a minute. To improve my conscious contact, to broaden and deepen my conscious contact, my consciousness, my intentional consciousness. Now, of course, it says God as we understood God, a phrase that was introduced in the manuscript because of the agnostics and the atheists in the group, the people that resisted organized religion or traditional religious concepts. And it's wonderful that that phrase is in there. It's the silver bullet of the spirituality of the 12-step program, because you don't have to believe anything that's a dogma or given to you by anybody else. But we take some actions that will give us an awareness of and a practice of believing in something that we've created for ourselves. The concept. We don't create God. That would be silly. We create our concept. And there are two things that we pray for. Prayer is when we're talking. Prayer is when we're in intimate conversation with a person or with a reality that we're establishing a friendship with, a relationship with, an intimacy with. Prayer is not about words, it's about intention. But the intention here, and I love to repeat this at any occasion I can to remind people of what we're doing in terms of improving our consciousness. Knowledge of God's will for me. I need to know better. And then the power to carry that out. I need to do better. I don't know better on my own. That was clear at age 48 when I was doing this work, 4 years sober for the very first time. Although I was 4 years sober, I was still doing the things that I had done when I was drinking. I had no internal guidance, internal compass, internal principles or guide rails. Expediency was my only motivation. So I began to learn what to do better. And then, because of the balance of the steps, I began to learn how to do better. But I had to get the knowledge first, and then I had to have the power to do it. Most of us know that, and that's the whole essence of unmanageability, isn't it? Most of us know better, we just don't do better. Some of us don't do better unconsciously. Most of us don't do better consciously. That's what guilt and shame is all about. It's a powerful, powerful set of words that Bill put together. So this man had me, his first instruction were the first instruction I gave you, and I hope you've done it. You look up the word meditation in the dictionary. You've heard it in meetings, I'm sure. Prayer is when you're talking to God. Meditation is when you're listening to God. It's actually simple. It seems simplistic, but quite frankly, it's the simplicity of deep wisdom. Prayer is when I'm talking, but it's not about the words. It's about the conversation. It's about the intention. What's your intention? Unfortunately, a religious practice becomes robotic because we pray words that are given to us by somebody else, and we pray them as if there's a magic formula. And we become brain dead. I mean, that's why I try as consciously as possible to pray the Serenity Prayer. It's a fabulous, soul-penetrating, curtain-rending prayer if you're conscious of what it is you're saying. Prayer is not about words, it's about intention. Meditation is listening. And that sounds cool. Listening to what? Listening with what? Those are the key questions that I didn't even know enough to ask at the time. So I looked up the word meditation in a dictionary. My Webster's dictionary, and I have 2 or 3. I have one from 1900, I have one from 1935, and I have a current dictionary because I want to know the flavor of the words at the different cultures that Bill was exposed to. He was growing up and educated in the 1900s, early 1900s. He wrote the big book in 1939, so he was using the current definitions of words as they were understood in the late 30s. But then I like to see how words change, and so I look at a current dictionary. My current dictionary was pretty much what the other dictionaries had said. It said directed thinking. It was startling to me to read the simple definition that was so contrary to my approach to meditation. I had been in a monastery where they did contemplation. They called it meditation. I had been exposed in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s to the Eastern philosophies and teachers. Tibet and China and Japan and India. And what they did, they called meditation. What I've discovered is it's not meditation, what they do from the East and what I did in the monastery. It's called contemplation. Prayer is when I'm talking to God. Meditation is when I'm listening to God. And contemplation is when I'm in the presence of God for the mere purpose of being in the presence. Contemplation comes from the Latin word templare, temple space, the house of God, the sanctuary, the tabernacle, the synagogue, the chapel, the cathedral, the house of God. Contemplare is to be in the temple space, in the presence of the divine. Wherever you are, I'm the tabernacle of the divine. It's not poetic. It's quite mystical because I see it as the fourth dimensional reality, as does Bill, and you'll see that in step 2. He asks the question at the beginning of chapter 4, where and how are we going to find this power, on page 45, and then 10 pages later on page 55, he answers the question. He answers it twice. He wants to really make the point. He doesn't want to be redundant. He wants to emphasize it. You're going to find this power if you search diligently, if you search fearlessly, if you think honestly deep down inside of you, and that's the only place that you'll find this reality. We saw it a little bit captured, if you remember the phrase in the Spiritual Awakening last week, the crossover page from page 567 to 568, unsuspected inner resource. Saying the same thing, unsuspected. I didn't know that I would find God deep inside myself, inner, deep inside myself, the soul of my soul, the breath of my breath, the life of my life. Again, I'm being a little poetic there, but I believe it's existential, meaning that it's an attempt at describing the reality of my belief system anyway. Unsuspected, didn't know it was there. Inner, didn't know it was inside of me. Resource, a power that is in me that isn't me, but that is available to me. That's an early introduction to step 2, or some different facets of it, but it's the basic assumption, of course, of step 11. Steps 2 and 3 are the assumptions of step 11. Step 2 is a decision about God. Step 3 is a decision for a relationship with that we call God, whatever that is for us. Steps 4 through 9 and 10 actually are clearing out the obstacles to that relationship in us, so that in step 11, we have the conscious contact, and on a daily basis, we improve that conscious contact. Stuff is really simple and straightforward. As he says on page 14 at the top, simple but not easy. In Bill's story on page 14 at the top, simple but not easy. It's one of my favorite phrases, so I have it memorized. Simple but not easy. A price has to be paid. It means the destruction of self-centeredness. That's the spiritual malady. That's the unmanageability. That's the deflation of the ego at depth that happens as we apply and journey through steps 4 through 9 and continue in step 10, the deflation of the ego at depth. And then he goes on in that very paragraph, we must turn in all things to the Father of light who presides over us all. See that turning, that's step 3. That's the commitment to turn. The turning itself takes place in steps 4 through 9 and is confirmed on a daily basis in step 10, turning to be in alignment with power. We must turn in all things to the Father of light who presides over us all. You see, it's the light in us that dispels the darkness in us, like the dimmer switch analogy. The brighter the light, the less the darkness. And at some point in the light becoming brighter, the addiction is dissipated and removed, placed in a position of neutrality. but the dimmer switch is on a greased axle, and it's hardwired to go backwards if I don't lean into it. Our way of living, 10, 11, and 12. I have a daily reprieve. I'm not cured of my unmanageability. I'm not cured of my spiritual malady. I'm not cured of my self-will run riot. These terms will have so much more resonance after we do step 1 and then steps 2 and 3. So I looked up the word in a dictionary. Meditation. Bill says we begin with an evening review. What an odd thing from my OCD approach to everything. I'm very organized in detail. Not compulsively, but it could happen. Why wouldn't Bill start with the morning? I don't know. That would be logical from my standpoint. The sun rises and we have morning, noon happens and the day vanishes, and the evening the sun sets and we have evening. That's would be the norm. But Bill starts in the evening, and it must have been intentional. I actually don't know why, but I think that it's so that we can evaluate the components of tomorrow morning's meditation. Is there anything I didn't clean up today that I need to take care of tomorrow? So he sets us up for the morning practice. He says we think about the 24 hours ahead and we consider our plans for the day. Back to the definition of meditation, directed thinking. In the big book, Bill says, upon awakening, we ask God to direct our thinking. You see, Bill knew what the definition of meditation was. Bill had been trained in the Oxford group. The Oxford group was a group of Christians. First century Christianity was their purpose of trying to recreate. What was it like at the time of Jesus when these Jews were thrown out of the synagogue for following Jesus? They met in people's homes and they read the scripture, the only scripture that was available before the Christian scriptures were written. They read the Hebrew scriptures, either together or by themselves. And they read them to get guidance. And they sat and they reflected on those scriptures. And then they shared their reflections and their conclusions with their family or with one another if they were together in a group. That was the Oxford group, trying to recreate that first century Christianity, meeting in people's homes, praying and then reading and then meditating and then sharing. Does that sound familiar? Sounds like an AA meeting to me. Sounds like a 12-step fellowship meeting to me. Exactly. That's our roots. Now, Bill separated from the Oxford group in 1937 because they didn't like alcoholics and they wanted him to focus on the Christian message rather than the recovery message. And Bill said, no, I have a different destiny. Thank you so much for getting me sober, and I'm going to go on my way. Dr. Bob, who had been a member of the Oxford group 2.5 years before he ever met Bill, left the Oxford group when the big book was published in April of 1939. But both of them had a deep regard and a deep respect for the Oxford group because they had the 6 steps that gave them the spiritual awakening, that gave them the freedom from alcohol, and then gave them the freedom from unmanageability, gave them a spiritual way of living. Back to the definition of meditation, directed thinking. The big book says, upon awakening, we ask God to direct our thinking. This man had me outline it. That's what's here in a short version on the PowerPoint. I outlined what's in pages 85 to 88 after reading and highlighting it. The first part is an inventory in the evening. It's got a few questions. It's not all negative. Some of it's positive. It's not all about liability. Some of it's about what are your plans to contribute tonight or tomorrow. How did you do in contributing? So it's a step of evolution beyond step 4, although it's a repetition of step 4. It's a step beyond step 10, but it's a repetition of step 10. There's 3 inventories indicated in the steps. Step 4, the mother of all inventories, that deep dive, uncovering the exact nature of our wrongs. And then step 10, the spot check inventory, which we'll talk about next week. When I'm disturbed, there's something wrong with me on the spot, I take care of it. And then the 11-step inventory, which we do at night. There's no time frame, whether it's a minute or an hour. There's no particular process to it. It's really up to each of us to develop this kind of a consciousness practice. I consider it like the image of a radar sweep. I kind of sweep my day. How did it go? Did I violate any of my own understanding of spiritual principles in terms of my thinking, my attitude, or my behavior? I don't ask all of those questions in the book. I did at one time early on, but now I'm much more spontaneous with it. Radar sweep. But the morning practice is my favorite practice. I've probably done more workshops and more recordings and more work and more writing in the area of meditation than I've done in any other area in the broad genre of spirituality and certainly of the steps. We ask God to direct our thinking. That's the instruction in the big book. The dictionary said meditation is directed thinking. This man said to me, Herb, it's a prayer. Anytime the book suggests that you talk to God, that's a prayer. We ask, it's a code in the big book. We ask God to direct our thinking. It goes like this, Herb. God, please direct my thinking. I laughed. I hope you are. The simplicity of it was underwhelming. But then he said something that's not in the big book. What's in the big book, it says, think about the 24 hours a day, consider your plans. They're on the screen there. Those are the 2 keywords. Think about the 24 hours a day, consider your plans. It doesn't tell you what that means. The man asked me to make up my own definitions of what those 2 terms meant, so I did. Think about the 24 hours a day. Okay, that's about my day planner, my activities. What am I going to do today? And I do a radar sweep in my imagination. I don't look at my day planner, although sometimes I actually do. I have it with me at the time. I do my morning meditation, as well as a yellow pad and a pen when I do my meditation. Because if, in fact, I get some guidance that I want to remember, I make a little note so that I don't have to try to remember it and then distract myself from my meditation practice. Think about the 24 hours ahead is about my activity, my doing for the day, my schedule. Is there anything on my schedule of activities that outside of the principles of spirituality and my relationship with reality as I understand it? It's pretty fast because usually I'm pretty clean. Consider your plans for the day. Okay, I made up a definition of that. What is that? Who am I going to be today? If think about the 24 hours ahead is, what am I going to do? Perhaps consider your plans for the day is, who am I going to be? And you'll hear me regularly talk about being insensitive and inconsiderate. It's my Achilles heel. I'm an efficiency nut, and I don't consider other people's feelings sometimes. I'm much better than I used to be, but I'm not as good as I will be. So usually it's Oh, I was inconsiderate yesterday. I think I'll try to focus on being considerate today. I was unkind yesterday. Today I'll attempt to be more kind today. Yesterday I was distracted in a frivolous way. Today I'll try to be more mindful. So it's usually a commitment to correct the character defect du jour. In step 10, and we'll see it next week, Bill says, watch for resentment and fear and dishonesty and selfishness. The 4 things we looked at in step 4. Watch for them when they crop up. He doesn't say if. We're human beings and we never transcend our humanity. There's always some fine sandpaper that we can apply to smooth out the bumps in our personality. But here's something that's not in the big book that cracked it open for me. 4 years sober, having spent 7 years in a monastery, I did not know what meditation was or how to do it. I'm beginning to learn the way that this man is helping me unpack the big book by understanding the words and outlining it the way I'm talking about it with you. But this, what I'm about to say, was the key that unlocked the door, that opened the door, and I haven't had a problem with meditation since. Sounds ominous, because it is. Think about the 24 hours ahead, consider your plans for the day, and listen. Meditation is directed thinking. Listen to your thinking as the possible answer to your prayer. God, please direct my thinking. I begin to think and consider, and in the very thinking and consider, I'm assuming that there's the possibility that my very thoughts are the gift of an answer to my prayer. My thoughts and my feelings and my awareness and my sensations and my imagination and my memory, whatever I'm conscious of, I try to be very conscious of. Is this just my ego rising up again? Or is in fact this, some people call it the wee small voice. Last year I did a little more research on that word, which you see it in books and you hear it in meetings, and it sounds really cool, the wee small voice. But I'd never seen it from the translation. I'd never seen it from the original Aramaic. I don't read Aramaic, but I went back to a translation that was more credible. And what it says is, the phrase is not the wee small voice, it's the tiny whispering sound. Now that might sound way too subtle and not much different, but from my standpoint, it's not subtle and it's very different. Tiny whispering sound. That's why we stay still. That's why we stay silent. That's why we try to contain our thinking, direct our thinking. That's why we try to improve our consciousness about our consciousness. Here in California, we're plagued, especially in the last several years, with brush fires, mountain fires, hill fires. They get raging and out of control, and they destroy people and property. Fire in a free form like that in the hills is destructive. But fire in my fireplace was quite warming tonight. Fire in my stove, the heat of the stove, is quite effective in cooking my meals. The difference is one is out of control and one is contained. Our thinking and feelings out of control is probably what got us here. Our thinking and our emotions contained will keep us here. That's the purpose of meditation. to contain our thinking, to contain our emotions, so that I'm managing my thinking, I am managing my emotions, my thinking and my emotions are not managing me. You see, I have free will. The two things that make us specifically human is that we have a mind that thinks and a will that decides and takes free actions, voluntary actions. You'll see in step one that there are many, many, many thoughts and actions that are not free. Compulsion, obsession, addiction, self-will run riot. We'll look deeply at all of those human aspects of the sources of our trouble. I asked you that question in the beginning. You've got an answer right now, but you'll have a much deeper answer by the time we finish the first step, and then a much deeper answer by the time you finish your fourth step as to the source of your suffering. Mostly what we see are the symptoms of our suffering, the products of our suffering. And we don't deal with the source, we deal with the symptoms, and therefore we continue to suffer. On page 86, Bill Wilson says, if we have the proper attitude and work at it, it will work. If we have the proper attitude, we're here to improve our consciousness, our conscious contact, and work at it. He doesn't use the word, but most of the teachers of any tradition in meditation talk about a practice. As human beings, we need to practice to get competent at doing something. If we were a toddler attempting to learn how to ride a bike, we got a small little two-wheeler with training wheels. And if one of the parents was very patient and the training wheels worked and we had a lot of diligence and fortitude, eventually we learned how to ride with the training wheels, and then they took the training wheels off, and then as we grew, so did the size of the bike. It's the same with going to the gym, isn't it? It's the same with learning a musical instrument. If you have any talent, you have a good teacher, and you practice, you'll get better. You go from chopsticks to Chopin. Not my experience. I have no musical talent at all. A practice. My own spiritual director says all people on a spiritual path have a spiritual practice. This is a 4-line mantra. All people on a spiritual path have a spiritual practice. And they practice their practice. And they're faithful to their practice. And then their practice is faithful to them. That's our journey. Steps 1 through 9 get us to an effective relationship with power. Steps 1 through 9 are the rocket launch Bill talks about. In step 1, we get into the rocket. That's our job, to get aboard. But once we get on board, the rocket takes us to where the rocket's going to go. We have some levers in there. We have some ability to manage and steer, but the rocket's going to take us where it's going to take us. And where it's going to take us in orbit around the light, in orbit around the light. Steps 1 through 9 are a 3-stage launch. 1 through 3, our relationship with power off the ground. Steps 4 through 7, our relationship with ourself. Steps 8 and 9, and I would throw in 10 at this point in this conversation, in this context, our relationship with others. But then we're in orbit around the light. Now, if you saw Hidden Figures, the movie, this is where I came up with this metaphor. It made so much sense to me in terms of the parallel with the step process and Bill's comment about a rocket launch into the 4th dimension. once we're in orbit, we can't stay in orbit if we don't do something. We need to move the levers. We need to move the energy. We need to manage and manipulate the controls so that we stay in orbit. Steps 10, 11, and 12 are the steps on the daily basis that are the levers of the controls and the energy that keep us in orbit around the light. Being in the orbit around the light, we build a shield, a spiritual shield that protects us from our addiction and protects us from our unmanageability. We stay free of our addiction as long as we're in relationship to power. We stay in relationship to power to the extent that we remove the obstacles to that relationship. In step 10, we foster that relationship by improving our consciousness in step 11, continuing to remove the obstacles in the evening inventory. And in step 12, we're guided by principles. See, these are the guidelines, the guardrails that tell us how to think and how to feel and how to behave, these principles that come from inside of us, not from outside of us. That's the biggest difference. When I took off my black robe, I gave up my meditation and I began doing things that even civilized human beings, developed and mature human beings don't do. Part of that due to the addiction and just part of that due to the wrinkles in my own personality. But it had all come from the outside, family rules and social norms and cultural values. None of it was mine, even my religious tradition. I put it on like I put the black robe on, and when I took the black robe off, I didn't have any religious traditions of any consequence. But when I finished the step work at the end of 1988, I was organically changed on the inside. I was given principles that are mine from the inside. I was given a tool that allowed me to understand what meditation was, the practice, and that I could, in fact, improve my consciousness and improve my conscious contact on a daily basis. I did it out of pure faith in the first year. I had an outline. It's in the Way of Life document, pages 44 to 51. Many people use it as a script. If you don't have a practice, many people use that outline that I have because it includes the prayers and some direction and some reflections and some questions to prime the pump, to establish the practice and the exercises, and then they become more virtuoso after they've established the basic routines, the basic thoughts, the basic words, the basic practice. I started with 5 minutes. I built it to 15 minutes. That was my goal. After about 3 months, I was at 15 minutes, and I continued doing that for about a year. But after about 6 months, I was getting really bored because I was doing the routine. You see, I got back into the monk mode, and I was reading the script and I was reading the prayers, but I wasn't giving it much mindfulness, much consciousness. I was following, quote, the rules. And despite the fact I'd had a spiritual awakening, I was still somewhat asleep in this area. And I went to a man who understands spirituality and meditation. He himself had been a monk, was at that time a clinical psychologist, and knew nothing about the 12-step program. I laid out to him the 12 steps as I understood them at that time. Step 1, the powerlessness and the balance of the steps to seek power. And step 11, to continue to foster your relationship with power. I mean, I spent 45 minutes giving him a more detailed description of that, but he was really bright and really intuitive and really spiritual, and he really understood what I was talking about. And at the end of the 30 or 45 minutes, he said, Herb, I get it. You have a book, you have a commitment, you've worked the steps, you're at step 11, you've outlined it, you understand it, you have a practice, you have a chair, you have a gong, you have a candle, you have all the accoutrements of that a meditator would have, the right pillow, etc., and you sit there because it's a task for you to accomplish meditation. It's a task for you to become spiritual. And he was quite dramatic. And I said, well, okay. He said, I want you to get it. I want you to get it. Because you've had the experience. You're awake now, and you really want to practice this practice of consciousness. Think this thought. You're as powerless over your spiritual life as you are over alcohol having no power at all. He said, again, think this thought. You're as powerless over your prayer and meditation as you are over alcohol having no power at all. Sit in the presence of power, humbled by your powerlessness, and grateful for the ability to be aware of that. That's when he gave me that mantra. All people on a spiritual path have a spiritual practice, and they practice their practice. And when they practice their practice, when they're faithful to their practice is faithful to them. He said, you're responsible for the effort, Herb, and the results are none of your business. Well, that was so contrary to my whole nature. That was so contrary to my corporate training and success in the business world. My boss had on his desk, don't confuse effort with results. It was just the opposite. My kids still quote me because that's how I raised them. He said, you're responsible for the effort and the results are none of your business. Don't judge your meditation. Don't evaluate your meditation. There's only 2 mistakes that you can make, he said. This is just so powerful because it's so simple. There's only 2 mistakes that you can make. 1, not show up. 2, leave early. If you've committed to 5 minutes, set your timer. You're a working guy. You don't want to misstep here and you don't want to be distracted by the timing. Set a timer. And the timer will tell you when you're done. It was magical. It took all the pressure off of me about thinking what time it was, and I didn't want to get lost in meditation and, all of the stuff that we do when we're novices at all of this. And I set it for 5 minutes. He said, the timer will tell you when you're done. You're responsible for the effort and the results are none of your business. As I was leaving his office that day in 1989, he said, oh, by the way, Herb, if you want to know if your meditation is effective, after 3 months of a consistent practice, building it from 5 minutes to 20 minutes, he made the suggestion that it be a minimum of 20 minutes, which I did then. I went back to the 5 minutes based on his new information of sitting there quite conscious and powerless and thinking my thinking and paying attention to my thinking as I had already been instructed to do. And then I built it to 20 minutes. He said, once you've got a daily practice and you're practicing it for 3 months, here's how you can tell whether it's effective or not. Ask your wife how you're treating her. Pay attention to how you're driving on the freeway. Pay attention to how you treat retail personnel in a store or at the airline, because you will become a softer, kinder, more considerate human being. That's the litmus test. My head will always lie to me. My feelings will more regularly lie to me. But my feet will never lie to me. My feet, my behavior tells me exactly who I am. My feet, my behavior tells me what I believe. My feet, my behavior tells me what my principles are. And that is very confrontational. My feet are my litmus test of my emotional maturity and my spiritual sobriety. There's lots more. I'm not going to go through all of it here. Bill says we conclude this period of meditation with a prayer, that we be shown all through the day what our next step is to be, and be given whatever we need to take care of such problems. That's incorporated in that script that I mentioned in the Way of Life document. I always end my morning practice with the 7-step prayer as a commitment to the removal of the character defect du jour that I talked about earlier, but also because of the last line of that prayer. As we go out from here to do your bidding. Amen. What a launching pad for the day. I'm going out from here with the invitation that I got in my meditation. I sit in meditation to get guidance for the day. That's the whole point of the meditation. I think about the 24 hours ahead. I consider my plans for the day. I then listen to my thinking and my feelings and my awareness and my consciousness and all of whatever I'm conscious of as the possible voice of God, giving me guidance for the day. And we get better as we practice. And that's what he says too. He says, go to outside resources, very clear in the end of the description or suggestions on prayer and meditation. He says there's thousands of years of efforts by many cultures. In listening to that, the following year, a teacher who became one of my consciousness teachers, Father Thomas Keating, came to town and did a 3-day training on a contemplative practice that he brought out of the monastery into society. It was the Christian Catholic version of what the Buddhists have been doing thousands of years before the Christians were even around, called contemplation. He calls it centering prayer. He calls it the first rung on the ladder of contemplation. And as I understand it today, and if you watch or listen to that workshop that I did, you'll hear this in much more detail, of course. But my understanding of prayer, that's an action of our body talking, whether it's out loud or silently, and with or without words, it doesn't matter. But it's our movement to have communication, intimate communication, building this relationship, this friendship. And meditation is my listening to my thinking, a very active process. I don't try to quiet my mind. That's a misnomer in meditation, unless you're talking about distractions. Many of us have that problem of distraction, and some of it's even chemical or physical in terms of ADD or OCD. But I listen to my thinking, actively listening to my thinking and my consciousness. That's the function of my mind for meditation. But contemplation is a function of my will, as I understand it. Father Thomas Keating talked about consenting to the presence, acknowledging the presence with my mind, but consenting to the presence, to the energy of that presence, sitting in that presence, in the tabernacle, in the space in the house of the divine, consenting to have the energy and the power of that, whatever it is, have its way with me. Very much like the image of the potter and the clay in one of the scripture stories. The potter is the divine potter sitting in front of the spinning clay wheel, forming some type of utensil. A lump of clay, that's me on this spinning table. And I sit there in the presence of this energy, inviting it and giving it permission to have its way with me and to shape me for that day, to be a channel of light and to be a channel of grace. Those aren't my thoughts about it. That's my intention. I attempt not to have thoughts in the contemplative stance. I try to sit there in that presence, aware only of the presence, and any awareness other than the presence I consider a distraction. And I have a mechanism to bring me back to my center. If I were to allocate time, I probably spend 2 or 3 or 4 minutes in prayer, 5 or 10 minutes in meditation, and 15 to 30 minutes in my contemplative practice. But that came up over time as I started with the 5 minutes, built it to 10 and built it to 20, and eventually retired and was able to be a little bit more liberal with my time. If you don't have a practice and you want a practice, begin with 1 minute. Oh, Herb, that's just not enough. Yeah, it's 1 more minute than you're doing right now. 1 minute, not of prayer. 1 minute, not necessarily of meditation, although that would be all right. But 1 minute of what I call intentional consciousness, being aware of your consciousness for the sole purpose of listening. 1 minute, 30 days in a row. It might take you 60 days or 90 days or 6 months to get 30 days in a row. Because if you miss a day, you start counting again. But once you have 30 days of 1 minute, you will have established the beginning of a habit of a practice. So as I said, prayer is an intimate conversation. Why do we do it? To form a relationship. Why? What do you believe about God? In the 12-step program, that's your decision. What do you believe about power? What do you believe about consciousness? What do you believe about a meaning or a power other than yourself in the universe or nature? I sometimes just refer to it as the mystery. The mystery, because I don't need to know that it is. I just need to believe and hope that it is and act as if it's true. The outcome is, of course, conscious contact. What about meditation? What is it? It's thinking and listening. Why do we do it? Well, some people do it for physical health. Some people do it for psychological well-being. But step 11 is not any of that. Step 11 is theology, not biology or psychology. It's about our relationship with Theos, whatever that means to you. Theos, the God of our not understanding. The purpose is to become a lantern. That's my image of a sponsor. I'm not the light, but I'm a channel of the light. I'm a lantern. I stand by the path as a lantern, shining the light of my experience on the path that I walk so that others can walk that path and have their own experience. Bill very astutely in the 12 and 12 gives us the value proposition that I'd like to chat about here for a minute. Because everybody believes that meditation is probably a good thing. They could probably quote studies even. And they'll say, well, it's step 11. Of course, it's really important. It's critical to my sobriety. It's critical to my life. Do you do it? Nope, don't have time. Well, obviously, they don't believe what they're talking about then. Because if you believed it was important, you would be doing it. If you're not doing it, and I'm sorry to be so confrontational, I don't mean to be rude. I do mean to wake you up. If you're not doing a daily meditation, it's because you don't believe it's necessary, or you don't believe you're powerless, or there's something amiss with your belief system if you're not doing it. Bill tells us in the 12 and 12, as air, water, sunshine, and food are necessary, essential for our nourishment and sustenance, prayer and meditation are necessary for the nourishment and sustenance of our soul. Do you believe it? Do you believe it? Next week's assignment is to do the next piece of work in assignment 2. It would be item number 3, 4, and 5, which is about step 10 primarily. And it would do you well to look at not only the big book 84 and 85 in step 10, but also to look at the chapter in the 12 and 12, one of the best chapters in the 12 and 12, because it really clarifies the tool of the 10 step and how it's used and why it's used. There's an outline in the Way of Life document on pages 42 and 43. There was some confusion, which I created, and I apologize for that, in the assignments where my assignments are for more than just this workshop. And for those other workshops, I don't go as deep, or I don't go as deep as I intend to go in this workshop. So I have them as a requirement, listen to recordings that were made a few years ago in a weekly telephone workshop, because it was at a time when I did go deep in the telephone workshop. It took about 18 months to go through the 12-step process. And so I have a lot more unpacking of the big book and the steps in that than I have been doing lately. However, in this, because of the new structure of Monday and Tuesday, it's not as essential. It still would probably be a good supplement. I've talked to many people who have used most of my resources, and they say it's still a wonderful supplement. And you hear different words at different times said in different ways, because that was like 10 years ago for me. So you might find that helpful. So now I'm going to go off of this. One other thing on the slide here. The consciousness practice, becoming a lantern. I'm not responsible for the effort. Excuse me, I am responsible for the effort, not the results. It's a journey, not a destination. In fact, in my new book on meditation, published by Hazelton, that first chapter describes in detail most of the areas that I've talked about here in terms of the consciousness practices. But as part of the preparation of that manuscript, it came to me in my meditation that the journey is the destination. Meditation is a journey. It's not the destination. This man said, you're not doing your meditation to become spiritual. You're doing your meditation to have a relationship with God. You're not doing your meditation to become a good meditator. You want to improve your meditation practice so that you're improving your conscious relationship with God. I mean, he completely turned my thinking around, because I was so much more product rather than process oriented. And this is a process, not a task. It's an experience, not an event. But it's not a feeling. For us addicts, feelings are a sand trap, quicksand. Feelings are really important, absolutely wonderfully important for survival and for navigating life. Absolutely. In the spiritual life, though, if you chase your feelings, feeling good, you will chase the spirit away. It just won't, because it's not about feelings. Feelings are a biochemical reaction to my perception of reality. Meditation is not. It's not a chemical reaction. It's some type of alchemic reaction of the combination of my mind and my will in connection with great God's grace and gift. I call it self-realization. More about that later. Certainly becoming a lantern, but so that we can be lighting the path. That's the whole point.